What would you do if your family forced you into a nursing home against your will? Would you fight it? Would you accept it gracefully? Would you find a way to make them regret their decision? Well, when they loaded my furniture into that moving truck, I made sure they'd discover exactly who really owned the house they were so eager to have to themselves. My name is Betty, and this is the story of how my children's greed and impatience led them to make the biggest mistake of their lives. It's a story about assumptions, about respect for elders, and about what happens when people let convenience override compassion in family decisions. The beginning of this nightmare started on a Tuesday morning in October, though the seeds had been planted months earlier through a series of conversations I was never meant to hear. I was in my garden, tending to the late-season roses, when my daughter Linda and my son Robert arrived at my house unannounced. Through the kitchen window, I could hear them talking to my daughter-in-law Sarah about the situation with Mom. "She's getting too old to live alone," Linda was saying, her voice carrying that tone of false concern that I'd learned to recognize over the past year. "Last week she forgot to turn off the stove, and yesterday I found expired milk in her refrigerator." The stove incident had been a simple mistake. I'd been interrupted by a phone call while making tea, and had left the burner on low for maybe 20 minutes. The expired milk was a single container that was 2 days past its sell-by date, hardly evidence of cognitive decline. But in Linda's narrative, these minor incidents had become proof of my incompetence. "Plus," Robert added, "this house is way too big for one person. She can't maintain it properly anymore, and frankly, it's a waste of valuable real estate." Valuable real estate. There it was, the real motivation behind their sudden concern for my well-being. "I've been researching assisted living facilities," Sarah chimed in, "and Sunset Manor has availability. It's expensive, but we could use the equity from this house to pay for her care." Use the equity from this house, as if the house already belonged to them instead of to me. I stood frozen in my garden, my hands still covered in dirt from repotting, listening to my own children plan my future, without any intention of including me in the decision-making process. They weren't asking whether I wanted to move to assisted living. They weren't exploring alternatives or offering to help me age in place. They were simply deciding that my independence was inconvenient for them, and planning to eliminate it. But what they didn't know, what they were about to discover in the most shocking way possible, was that their assumptions about ownership, inheritance, and authority were completely wrong. The house they were so eager to sell to pay for my nursing home care wasn't theirs to sell. It had never been theirs to sell, and their plan to use the equity to fund my assisted living was about to crumble in the most spectacular and expensive way imaginable. You see, what my children didn't know, what I had never bothered to tell them because I never thought it would matter, was that I had never actually transferred ownership of this house to them, despite their repeated assumptions that I had done so years earlier. The house had been purchased in 1979 by my late husband Frank and me, with both our names on the original deed as joint tenants with right of survivorship. When Frank passed away 12 years ago, ownership automatically transferred entirely to me. The house was mine, free and clear, with no mortgage and no co-owners. Over the years, my children had made various comments about when we inherit the house and what we'll do with Mom's property someday, and I had never corrected their assumptions because I believed they would treat me with love and respect regardless of financial considerations. I had assumed that their care for me was based on affection rather than anticipated inheritance. I was wrong about that, as I was about to demonstrate in the most painful way possible. But wait until you see what they discovered when they tried to implement their plan. The confrontation came 3 days after I'd overheard their planning session. Linda, Robert, and Sarah arrived at my house with printed brochures from Sunset Manor and a timeline for my transition to more appropriate living arrangements. "Mom," Linda began, settling into my living room like she was conducting a business meeting, "we've been thinking about your situation, and we believe it's time to consider some changes." "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already knew exactly what was coming. "Changes that would ensure your safety and well-being as you continue to age," Robert said, using the careful language they'd probably rehearsed. "We found a wonderful assisted living facility that would be perfect for someone at your stage of life." Stage of life. As if turning 78 automatically meant I was incapable of managing my own affairs. "I'm not interested in assisted living," I said simply. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself in my own home." "Mom, you're not seeing the bigger picture," Sarah interjected. "This house is too much responsibility for you. The maintenance, the utilities, the safety concerns. It's all becoming too overwhelming. Overwhelming for whom? I had been managing this house and its maintenance for over 40 years. I knew every creaking floorboard, every drafty window, every quirky electrical outlet. The house wasn't overwhelming me. Their impatience to control it was overwhelming them. What if I'm not ready to move? I asked. Mom, we're not really asking, Linda said, her mask of false concern finally slipping to reveal the authoritarian underneath. We've already put down a deposit at Sunset Manor. The moving truck comes next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, they had made this monumental decision about my life and given me less than a week to adjust to the idea of losing my home, my independence, and my right to make my own choices. And what happens to my house while I'm at this assisted living facility? We'll take care of everything, Robert assured me. We'll handle the sale, manage the proceeds, and make sure the money is used for your care. They would handle everything. They would sell my house, manage my money, and make decisions about my care, all without my input, all based on their assumption that age had automatically transferred my legal and financial authority to them. But here's what shocked me most about this entire conversation. They genuinely believed they had the right to make these decisions for me. They weren't asking for permission or seeking my cooperation. They were informing me of changes they had already put in motion, expecting me to accept their choices gracefully and gratefully. They had no idea they were about to learn the most expensive lesson about assumptions they would ever receive. Now here's where everything changed completely. That night, after my children had left with their brochures and their timelines and their complete certainty that they could override my wishes, I sat in my bedroom and made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. I was not going to fight them publicly. I was not going to argue or plead or try to change their minds through emotional appeals. Instead, I was going to let them proceed with their plan, while I prepared a surprise that would teach them about the difference between what they assumed they could do and what they actually had the legal right to do. The first step was to call my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled Frank's estate and had been managing my legal affairs for over a decade. James, I said when he answered his phone, I need you to prepare some documents for me, and I need them to be ready by next Tuesday. What kind of documents, Betty? I need certified copies of my property deed, my will, and a power of attorney revocation, and I need you to prepare a letter explaining the legal implications of these documents for anyone who might be operating under false assumptions about my property ownership. There was a pause. Betty, is everything all right? Has someone been pressuring you about your property? My children have decided to move me to assisted living against my will and sell my house to pay for it. They seem to believe they have the authority to make these decisions for me. Do they have power of attorney? No. They have assumptions, but no legal authority whatsoever. Then they can't sell your house or make financial decisions on your behalf without your explicit consent. I know that, James. The question is whether they know that. Another pause. What exactly are you planning, Betty? I'm planning to let them discover the truth about property ownership and legal authority in the most educational way possible. Over the next week, I played the role of the compliant elderly woman who was accepting her children's decision with resignation. I allowed them to pack my belongings, coordinate with the assisted living facility, and make arrangements for the moving truck. I answered their questions about which furniture I wanted to take and which items could be disposed of or stored for later. But what I didn't tell them was that I was documenting everything, every assumption they made, every decision they made without consulting me, every statement that revealed their belief that they had the right to control my life and property. The most telling conversation happened when Linda and Sarah were discussing their plans for my house after I moved out. I think we should renovate the kitchen before putting it on the market, Sarah was saying. New countertops and appliances would increase the sale price significantly. Good idea, Linda agreed. And we should probably update the bathrooms too. Mom's taste is so outdated. They were planning renovations to a house they didn't own, discussing improvements to increase the sale price of property that wasn't theirs to sell, criticizing the decorating choices of the person who actually held the deed. But the most shocking revelation came when Robert joined the conversation. I've been thinking, he said, and I don't think we should put all the proceeds into Mom's assisted living account. She's not going to need hundreds of thousands of dollars for her care, and frankly, we've been supporting her in various ways for years. Maybe it's time we got some return on our investment. Return on their investment. My son was planning to steal the proceeds from selling my house and justify it as compensation for their minimal assistance over the years. How much do you think we should keep? Sarah asked. I'd say at least half, Robert replied. Mom will never know the difference, and we deserve something for all the time and effort we've put into taking care of her affairs. Taking care of my affairs. They had done nothing to take care of my affairs. They had made a few phone calls, visited occasionally, and complained about my independence. But in their minds, these minimal gestures justified theft on a massive scale. That's when I knew that what I was planning wasn't just about teaching them a lesson. It was about protecting myself from family members who were willing to steal from me while pretending to care for my well-being. But you haven't seen the most shocking part yet, because their plans went far beyond just selling my house. 3 days before the scheduled move to Sunset Manor, I made a discovery that changed everything about how I viewed my children's motivations and the scope of their betrayal. I was cleaning out my home office, preparing to pack my important documents, when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in my desk drawer, underneath some old tax returns, was a power of attorney document that I had never signed, never seen, and certainly never authorized. The document was professionally prepared, complete with notarization and witness signatures, granting Linda and Robert comprehensive authority over my finances, property, and medical decisions. According to the paperwork, I had supposedly signed this document 6 months earlier, giving my children the legal right to make all the decisions they had been making about my life. But I had never signed any such document. I had never met with the notary whose seal appeared on the paperwork. I had never been in the presence of the witnesses whose signatures appeared alongside what was supposedly my signature. In other words, my children had forged a power of attorney document to give themselves legal authority they didn't actually possess. This wasn't just about them making assumptions about their inheritance or their right to make decisions for me. This was about fraud, forgery, and a criminal conspiracy to steal my property and control my life through falsified legal documents. I photographed every page of the forged document and immediately called James Morrison. "James, we have a much bigger problem than I originally thought," I said when he answered.
"What's happened, Betty?"
"I found a power of attorney document that I never signed, giving my children authority over all my affairs. The notarization and witness signatures are all fraudulent." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought the connection had been lost. "Betty, are you certain you never signed such a document? Sometimes people forget about legal paperwork they've signed, especially if it was done during a stressful period." "James, I have never signed a power of attorney document. I have never met the notary whose name appears on this paperwork. I have never been in the presence of these witnesses. This document is a complete fabrication." "Do you have the original document with you?" "I have the original, and I've photographed every page for evidence." "Betty, if what you're telling me is accurate, your children have committed multiple felonies: forgery, fraud, elder abuse. These are serious criminal charges that could result in significant prison time." "I understand that, James. The question is, what do we do about it?" "First, we contact the police and file a report about the forged documents. Then we contact the district attorney's office about potential elder abuse charges. And finally, we make sure that your children understand they have no legal authority to make any decisions about your life or property." But I had a different plan in mind, one that would be more educational and more satisfying than simply filing criminal charges. "James, what if we let them proceed with their plan? What if we allow them to move me to assisted living and then reveal the truth about their forged documents and their complete lack of legal authority?" "Betty, I can't recommend that approach. If they're willing to forge legal documents, there's no telling what other criminal activity they might engage in." "But think about the impact, James. If we reveal the truth now, they'll claim it was all a misunderstanding, hire lawyers, and drag this out in court for years. But if we let them proceed with moving me out and trying to sell my house, they'll commit additional crimes that will be much harder to deny or explain away." "What additional crimes?" "Fraud, theft, conspiracy, maybe even elder abuse. Every step they take based on those forged documents will be another felony charge, another piece of evidence, another nail in their legal coffin." It was a risky plan, but it had one major advantage. It would create an undeniable record of their criminal intent and their willingness to systematically defraud their own mother for financial gain. But the most shocking discovery was still to come, because the forged power of attorney was just the beginning of what my children had been planning. Over the next 2 days, I conducted my own investigation into my children's activities, and what I found was a comprehensive conspiracy that went far beyond simply moving me to assisted living. Using the information from the forged power of attorney, I was able to trace several recent attempts to access my financial accounts. Linda had tried to add herself as a signatory to my checking account. Robert had attempted to get information about my investment portfolio. Sarah had contacted my insurance company claiming to be my authorized representative. All of these attempts had been unsuccessful because the institutions had required additional documentation that my children couldn't provide. But the pattern was clear. They had been systematically attempting to gain control of my finances for months, probably in preparation for this assisted living scheme. But the most damaging evidence came from phone records that James was able to obtain through his legal contacts. My children had been in communication with Sunset Manor for over 6 months, not just about my care, but about payment arrangements and financial guarantees. According to those phone records, they had told the facility that they had full legal authority over my finances and that payment for my care would come from the sale of family property. They had made commitments on my behalf without my knowledge and had used fraudulent documents to support their authority to make those commitments. In other words, they hadn't just forged a power of attorney document, they had been using that forged document to make legally binding agreements that would have obligated me to pay for services I had never requested from the proceeds of selling property they had no right to sell. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided me with the opportunity to teach them a lesson they would never forget. But wait until you see what happened when they tried to implement their plan. The morning of the move to Sunset Manor, I implemented what I now call Operation Reality Check. It was a carefully orchestrated plan, designed to let my children discover the truth about property ownership, legal authority, and criminal consequences in the most dramatic and educational way possible. I had packed my belongings as requested, allowing Linda and Sarah to direct the process while I played the role of the compliant elderly woman who was accepting her fate with resignation. But what they didn't know was that among my personal items I was taking to assisted living were all the original documents that would prove their fraud, copies of all their unauthorized attempts to access my accounts, and a detailed timeline of their conspiracy. More importantly, what they didn't know was that I had no intention of actually moving to Sunset Manor permanently. James Morrison had worked with the facility's administration to explain the unusual circumstances of my admission, and they had agreed to cooperate with our plan to expose the fraud being committed in their name. As the moving truck was being loaded with my furniture, I placed the most important document of all in a sealed envelope on my nightstand, the original property deed to my house, along with a letter from James Morrison explaining the legal implications of what my children were attempting to do. The letter was comprehensive and damning. To whom it may concern, Mrs. Betty Henderson is the sole legal owner of the property located at 8047 Maple Street. She has never signed a power of attorney document, granting anyone authority over her financial or property decisions. Any attempts to sell this property, access Miss Henderson's financial accounts, or make legal commitments on her behalf, without her explicit written consent, constitute fraud, forgery, and potentially elder abuse under state and federal law. But the most important part of the letter was the final paragraph. Mrs. Henderson has been made aware of unauthorized attempts to access her financial accounts, forged power of attorney documents, and false representations made to financial institutions and care facilities. All of these activities have been documented and reported to appropriate law enforcement agencies. Anyone continuing to engage in these activities will face immediate criminal prosecution. I placed that envelope where it would be easily found after I left, but not so obvious that it would be discovered before the moving truck departed. The transport to Sunset Manor was emotionally difficult, even though I knew it was temporary. Leaving the home where Frank and I had built our life together, where I had raised my children, where I had planned to spend my remaining years, it felt like a death, even though I knew I would be returning within a few days. Linda, Robert, and Sarah followed the transport van to the facility, helping me settle into my new accommodations, while maintaining their performance as caring family members who were making difficult decisions for my own good. "Mom, I know this is hard," Linda said as we unpacked my belongings in my small apartment at Sunset Manor. "But you're going to love it here, and you don't have to worry about anything anymore. We'll take care of everything." Everything, including stealing my property and using the proceeds for their own benefit while I lived in institutional care paid for with my own money that they had essentially embezzled. "What happens to my house while I'm here?" I asked, maintaining my role as the confused elderly woman who didn't quite understand what was happening to her life. "We'll handle all of that," Robert assured me. "The real estate market is very good right now, so we should be able to get an excellent price for the property." Excellent price for property that didn't belong to them, that they had no authority to sell, and that they were planning to steal the proceeds from. But the most telling moment came when Sarah pulled me aside and said, in what she probably thought was a comforting tone, "Betty, I want you to know that we're not going to put you in some terrible state facility when this money runs out. We'll make sure you always have good care, even if we have to contribute some of our own funds." Some of their own funds. She was planning to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from me, and then positioning herself as generous for potentially spending some small amount of her own money on my care in the future. But the real education was about to begin. That evening, after my family had left me settled in my new assisted living apartment, James Morrison called my children and arranged a meeting for the following morning. He told them he needed to discuss some paperwork issues related to my property transfer and care arrangements. What he didn't tell them was that the meeting would include representatives from the district attorney's office, the state elder abuse investigation unit, and the police department's fraud division. But you haven't seen the most shocking part yet, because their reaction to discovering the truth would reveal just how deep their criminal intentions really went. The meeting took place at James Morrison's law office at 10 a.m., the day after I'd been moved to Sunset Manor. Linda, Robert, and Sarah arrived expecting a routine discussion about property transfers and care arrangements. What they found instead was a conference room full of law enforcement officials and a table covered with evidence of their fraud. I wasn't present for this meeting. I was still at Sunset Manor, maintaining the fiction that I was a helpless elderly woman who had been placed there against my will by children who had legal authority over my life. But James called me immediately afterward to describe what had happened. "Betty," he said, his voice filled with amazement, "I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never seen such a comprehensive case of elder abuse and fraud. And I've never seen defendants react so badly to being caught. What did they say when you presented the evidence?" "Initially, they tried to deny everything. Linda claimed that you had given them verbal authorization to handle your affairs. Robert insisted that the power of attorney document was legitimate and that you must be suffering from memory problems if you didn't remember signing it. And when you showed them the proof that the document was forged, that's when things got really interesting." Sarah immediately blamed the others, claiming she had nothing to do with the forged documents and was just helping with the assisted living arrangements. Linda accused Robert of going too far with his schemes, and Robert claimed that you had told him months ago that you wanted him to have control over your property. So they turned on each other? Completely. By the end of the meeting, each of them was trying to pin the blame on the others, while minimizing their own involvement. It was like watching a criminal conspiracy collapse in real time. But the most damaging moment came when Detective Sarah Martinez from the Elder Abuse Unit presented them with the evidence of their unauthorized attempts to access my financial accounts and their false representations to various institutions. "Miss Henderson," she had told Linda, "you contacted your mother's bank 6 times over the past 4 months, claiming to have power of attorney and requesting access to her accounts. When the bank required documentation, you told them the paperwork was in process and asked them to expedite the authorization based on your mother's deteriorating mental condition." Linda's response, according to James, was to break down and admit that they had been planning this scheme for over a year. "We knew Mom would never agree to assisted living voluntarily," she had confessed. "And we knew she'd never give us authority over her finances while she was mentally competent. So we had to find a way to make it happen without her cooperation." Had to find a way. In other words, when faced with my refusal to surrender my independence and property voluntarily, their solution was to commit multiple felonies to override my wishes and steal my assets. But the most shocking revelation came when Detective Martinez presented them with the evidence of their communications with Sunset Manor. "Mr. Henderson," she had said to Robert, "you told the assisted living facility that your mother had specifically requested placement there, and that she had authorized you to handle all financial arrangements. But we have recordings of phone calls where you discussed strategies for managing her resistance and overcoming her objections to the placement." Robert's response was to blame me for forcing them to take desperate measures. "My mother is stubborn and unrealistic about her limitations," he had said. "She was never going to admit that she needed care, so we had to make the decision for her. Everything we did was for her own good, for my own good. Forgery, fraud, theft, and elder abuse, all justified as being in my best interest." But the confrontation was far from over, because the legal consequences they were facing were more severe than they had ever imagined. Detective Martinez explained that they were being charged with multiple felonies: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted theft. Each charge carried potential prison sentences, and the combined charges could result in decades behind bars. "But we're her children," Sarah had protested. "We were just trying to take care of her." "Ma'am," Detective Martinez had replied, "being someone's child doesn't give you the right to forge legal documents, steal their property, or make false representations to financial institutions. What you've done is commit serious crimes against a vulnerable elderly person." The meeting ended with all three of them being arrested and charged. Linda, Robert, and Sarah were taken into custody, fingerprinted and processed like the criminals they had become. But the most satisfying part of the entire confrontation, according to James, was their reaction when they learned that I was perfectly competent and had been aware of their scheme the entire time. "You mean she knew what we were doing?" Linda had asked. "Not only did she know," James had replied, "she documented everything, gathered evidence, and worked with law enforcement to build the case against you. Your mother is a very intelligent woman who was fully aware of your attempts to defraud her." Now here's where everything changed completely. 24 hours after my children were arrested, I checked myself out of Sunset Manor and returned to my own home. The home I had never legally lost, the home that had always been mine, the home that my children had planned to steal and sell for their own benefit. Walking back into my house felt like resurrection. Every room, every piece of furniture, every family photo told the story of a life that my children had tried to erase for their own financial gain. But more than that, it told the story of a woman who had refused to be victimized by the people who should have protected her most. The first thing I did was call James Morrison to discuss the legal aftermath of the confrontation. "James, what happens now? What are the potential consequences for Linda, Robert, and Sarah?" "Betty, they're facing serious charges. Elder abuse is a felony that carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. The fraud charges could add another 5 years. The forgery charges could add 3 to 5 years. And the conspiracy charges could add additional time on top of all of that. So we're talking about potentially decades in prison?" "We're talking about the possibility of decades in prison, yes. But more realistically, if they accept responsibility and plead guilty, they're probably looking at several years each, plus restitution, probation, and permanent criminal records." "And what about their attempts to access my financial accounts and their false representations to various institutions?" "Those are additional charges that the federal prosecutor is considering, since some of the fraud involved banks and other institutions that fall under federal jurisdiction. Wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, these could add federal charges on top of the state charges." The scope of the legal consequences was staggering, but it was also appropriate given the scope of their criminal conspiracy. Over the next few days, I received phone calls from each of my children, all calling from jail, all begging me to drop the charges and work this out as a family. Linda's call was the most manipulative. "Mom, I know we made some mistakes, but we're family. Surely you don't want to see your own children go to prison over a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? She called a year-long criminal conspiracy to defraud me and steal my property a misunderstanding. Robert's approach was to blame stress and financial pressure. "Mom, Sarah's been out of work, and we've been struggling financially. We weren't thinking clearly, and we made some poor decisions, but we never meant to hurt you." Poor decisions. As if forgery, fraud, and elder abuse were simply errors in judgment rather than deliberate criminal acts. Sarah's call was the most desperate. "Betty, please don't let them destroy our family over money. We can work this out. We can pay you back for any expenses you incurred. Just please don't let this go to trial. Pay me back." As if the issue was financial loss rather than betrayal, criminal activity, and their willingness to destroy my independence and steal my property for their own benefit. But the most important call came from my attorney, who had been contacted by defense lawyers representing all three defendants. "Betty, they want to negotiate a plea agreement. They're willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for your agreement not to pursue civil restitution and not to testify against them at trial." "What kind of reduced charges?" "Misdemeanor fraud instead of felony elder abuse. Probation instead of prison time. Community service instead of significant jail sentences." And what would I get in return for agreeing to this plea bargain? You'd avoid the stress and publicity of a trial. You'd get your life back without having to testify about the details of their fraud. And you'd preserve what's left of your family relationships. I thought about this offer for exactly 30 seconds before giving James my answer. No, absolutely not. What they did was not a misdemeanor. What they did was not deserving of probation. What they did was a systematic, year-long conspiracy to steal my property, destroy my independence, and defraud me of hundreds of thousands of dollars while I was still alive to stop them. Betty, are you sure? A trial will be difficult for everyone involved. James, if I accept this plea agreement, I'm sending the message that elder abuse is acceptable as long as it's committed by family members. I'm telling other elderly people that they should just accept being victimized by their own children rather than fight for their rights. And you're not willing to do that? I'm not willing to do that. My children made choices, and choices have consequences. They chose to commit crimes against me, and they can face the legal consequences of those crimes. The trial, when it finally took place 8 months later, was everything James had warned me. It would be difficult, emotionally draining, and publicly humiliating for everyone involved. But it was also something else. It was justice. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged power of attorney documents, the recorded attempts to access my financial accounts, the false representations to Sunset Manor and other institutions, the documented conspiracy to steal my property and use the proceeds for their own benefit. But the most damaging evidence was their own words, recorded during the investigation, where they discussed their plans to manage Mom's resistance and their belief that they deserved compensation for their minimal assistance over the years. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding all 3 defendants guilty on all charges. Linda received 4 years in prison plus 5 years of probation. Robert received 5 years in prison plus 5 years of probation. Sarah, who had played a smaller role but had still participated in the conspiracy, received 2 years in prison plus 3 years of probation. But the criminal sentences were just the beginning of the consequences. The civil lawsuit I filed against them resulted in a judgment of $500,000 in damages, not because I had actually lost that amount of money, but because the court determined that was the value of the property they had attempted to steal and the amount of financial harm they had intended to cause. Since none of them had $500,000 to pay the judgment, their wages were garnished for the next 15 years, ensuring that their criminal choices would have financial consequences for decades to come. But the most significant consequence was the complete destruction of our family relationships. Linda, Robert, and Sarah had chosen greed over love, convenience over compassion, and crime over respect. Those choices had permanent consequences that could never be undone, regardless of legal outcomes or financial settlements. 3 years later, as I write this story, I am still living independently in my own home. I am still managing my own finances, making my own decisions, and living my life according to my own choices, rather than my children's assumptions about what's appropriate for someone my age. I have not spoken to Linda, Robert, or Sarah since the day they were sentenced. They have not apologized for what they did, have not taken responsibility for their choices, and have not shown any genuine remorse for the pain they caused. But I have learned something important about family: respect and the difference between love and control. Real love doesn't involve stealing from someone for their own good. Real care doesn't require fraud and forgery. Real family relationships are based on respect for each other's autonomy and dignity, not on assumptions about who has the right to make decisions for whom. The house they tried to steal is now in a trust that will prevent anyone from ever again assuming they have the right to make decisions about my property without my consent. The independence they tried to destroy is now legally protected in ways that ensure my choices will be honored regardless of other people's opinions about my capabilities. And the lesson they learned about assumptions, authority, and consequences, that lesson cost them their freedom, their financial security, their family relationships, and their reputations in the community. But most importantly, it taught other families that elder abuse, even when committed by loving children who believe they're acting in someone's best interest, has serious legal consequences that can destroy lives and families permanently. If my story teaches you anything, I hope it's this: respect for elderly people isn't optional. It's required. Legal authority isn't something you can assume or forge. It's something that must be granted voluntarily. And family love isn't an excuse for criminal behavior. It's the very reason why such behavior is so devastating when it occurs. The property deed that I left on my nightstand became the foundation for justice, the evidence for prosecution, and the proof that assumptions about inheritance and authority can be the most expensive mistakes families ever make. I have more stories about family, respect, justice, and the importance of standing up for yourself even when the people who hurt you are the ones you love most. So pull up a chair, treasure your independence, and remember to subscribe to Grandma True Stories, because the most important lesson is that you're never too old to fight for your rights, and you're never too elderly to demand the respect you deserve.